Hi, I'm Alexis of Remy Crafty Hedgehog. Thank you for choosing my pattern video on how to make my Pisces Soap Sack. This pattern was also written in tandem with this beautiful sea moss soap sack pattern written by Sammi of Yarn Over Hook. These two patterns are making their premiere during Summer Stash Bash 2026. The two of us are teaming up with Soap Sack to help inspire crocheters around the world to crochet 1,000 soap sacks and donate it to local charities in need. The link to the written format of these patterns is linked below. So let's learn how to make the Pisces Soap Sack, which is the perfect size for any average bar of soap. The first thing that you need is some worsted weight cotton yarn. I recommend sugar and cream, and I'm using the colorway Beach Glass. Then you need a 5mm crochet hook and some stitch markers. I like to use a few extra just to help me along the way. That's enough supplies. Let's get started. Because this yarn cake is a little unwieldy, I'm going to throw it into a yarn bowl. We're going to start off by making the loop part that the soap sack hangs from. Here I am making a slip knot. Everybody makes these different ways, so it's okay if you don't make it exactly the way I do. If you would like to see how another person makes a slip knot, check out Sammi on Yarn Over Hook. She has a really good slip knot video. And now that I've made my slip knot, I'm going to chain 15. And there we have it, our 15 chains completed. Now we're going to go back and slip stitch into that very first chain. As you can see, we have just completed the loop that you'll be hanging your Pisces soap sack from. Alright, let's continue on with our setup row. We're going to chain 30. After I put in the first chain, I like to place a stitch marker just to make it easier for me to find it later. Here you can see me adding a green stitch marker to my very first chain. And then I'm going to follow it up with the rest of the chain stitches so that I end up with 30. At the end, I'm going to slip stitch into the first chain to close and then chain 1. I'll just zoom us right to the end of this round. Now that I've completed my 30 chain, I'm going to turn back in my work so that I can slip stitch back into that first chain, which I have marked with a stitch marker. Then I simply enter the stitch, create a slip stitch, and then chain 1, and then our setup round is complete. Round 1 starts in the very same stitch that I just slip stitched into, and I'm going to be creating 30 single crochets. First I'll remove my marker so I have more room, then I'm going to enter the stitch I just slip stitched into, single crochet, replace my marker, and continue single crocheting around, ending with 30 single crochets. Then I will slip stitch into the first single crochet to close, followed by a chain 1. I'm going to zip ahead to the end of this round. I'm just about to make my final single crochet. Then I'm going to add a end of round stitch marker on it. I find it easier in this particular method to use a stitch marker at the beginning and the end of every round. I like to use a green at the beginning and a red at the end, just to add a stop and go kind of vibe to it. Now I'm going to slip stitch into the first single crochet of this round, chain 1, and that completes round 1. Round 2 starts in the same stitch that you just slip stitched into. First, I'm going to remove my stitch marker. Then I'm going to enter that stitch and single crochet, replacing my stitch marker. Then I'm going to continue single crocheting around till I end up with 30 single crochets. Then I will slip stitch into the first single crochet and chain 1. I'm going to zip ahead to the end of the round. And here I am, about to complete my last couple of single crochets. That red stitch marker has come in very handy in letting me know where the end is. Of course, once I make my final stitch of the round, I remove it and replace it so that I can always keep track. Then I'm going to slip stitch into the first single crochet of the round, marked by the green marker. Then I'm going to chain 1, and that is the end of round 2. Alright, let's start round 3 and one of my favorite stitches. First off, starting in the same stitch that we just slip stitched into, I'm going to make a single crochet. I'm going to remove my marker, enter that same stitch, make a single crochet, then I'm going to replace my marker, and then I'm going to keep going until I have 7 completed single crochets. Now it's time to do the popcorn stitch. We're going to put 5 double crochets into the next stitch. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I always like to go back and count just to make sure that I have all 5. Once I've confirmed my count, I stretch the loop open a little bit, take my hook out, and add it back into the top of the first double crochet. Then I'm going to put that loop back on my hook and pull it through. Here you can see the top of the popcorn stitch, how it compresses all the double crochets together. Then we're going to chain 1, being sure not to pull this chain tight. You will be working into it in the next round. Then we're going to single crochet 14, starting in the stitch right after the popcorn. This way we can work our way around the head of the fish to make the other eye. I'm going to zip us ahead to that point. Alright, I've just completed my 14 single crochet. It's time for another popcorn in the next stitch. Remember, it's 5 double crochets all into the same stitch. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 5. Oops, there it goes. Gonna count all of them to make sure they're all there. Stretch the loop out a little bit, make my life easier. Then reinsert my hook into the top of the first double crochet. Slip that loop back onto my hook and pull it through. Again, you can see how the top of the double crochets are all stacked together. Then we're going to chain 1. Remember, do not make it tight. You'll be working into it later. Then we're going to single crochet 7, starting in the stitch right after the popcorn stitch. Now I've just completed my final single crochet. I'm going to change my end of row marker onto the stitch I just created. And I'm going to slip stitch into the first single crochet of the round. Then I'm going to chain 1. And that is the end of round 3. Let's start round 4, starting in the same stitch that you just slip stitched into, single crochet 7, Now here, it can get a little tricky. It may look like you want to work into that tiny bitty stitch right there, but you don't. We actually want to work into the chain that we created last round just after the popcorn. Single crochet into that chain 1. It might be a little tight, so you can use the hook end of your crochet hook to get in there more easily. There I am finishing my single crochet. Then I'm going to do 14 single crochets. Let me zoom ahead just a little bit. Here we are again, just above our other popcorn stitch. Remember, we don't want to work into that tiny little stitch. We want to work into the chain next with a single crochet. Sammi of Yarn Over Hook was actually the one who showed me that when you work into the chain after a popcorn stitch, it makes the popcorn pop a lot more. After that, we continue the round by doing 7 single crochets. Then slip stitching into the first single crochet and chaining 1. And that is the end of round 4. Look at how bulbous and cute those popcorn stitches are making the eyes. You can flatten them, shape them a little bit too after, but they are so cute either way. Let's start round 5. Round 5 is worked entirely in the front loops only of round 4. First, I'm going to remove my stitch marker. Then I'm going to use this needle just to show you what I mean by front loops. Right now, I'm under both loops of a stitch. The back loop and the front loop comprise it. For this round, we're going to work under the front loop only. We're going to use that back loop later, so I like to put an extra stitch marker into it just to hold on to it. To start my scallop stitch, I'm going to take my crochet hook and go under the front loop only of the stitch that I just slip stitched into. This might be a little bit tight, so feel free to use the hook end of your crochet hook to get under there. I'm going to create a single crochet and place my beginning of round stitch marker on it. Here I'm using my darning needle to show you the back loop that I left behind. Since I will be working into it later, I add an additional stitch marker here so that it is easier for me to find it at the end of the round. Now we've just done the very first step of our scallop stitch, which is a single crochet. Then we're going to skip a stitch and do 5 double crochets into the next stitch. And remember, unless it's specified otherwise, this entire round is worked entirely in the front loop only. So here I am putting 5 double crochets into the front loop only of this stitch, leaving behind the back loop. Now that I've completed the 5, I can skip the next stitch and single crochet into the front loop only of the next stitch. And that completes my very first scallop. And when you look behind the scallop, you can see all of the back loops that have been left behind. Now I'm going to continue on with my scallop stitches, working all the way around. I'll zoom ahead, but not quite as fast, to the end of the round to show you the next step. Here we are at the end of the round. As you can see, I will end the round with a single crochet into where my end of round marker is. Front loop only. Now when it comes to placing our end of round marker, we do not want to add it onto the final stitch of this scallop. We will not be working here again. Instead, add it to the back loop left behind by this stitch. Now I'm going to slip stitch into the first single crochet of the round under both loops. That's the one with the beginning of round marker. I go under both loops, slip stitch, and I do not chain at this point. Then I'm going to slip stitch again into the back loop that I left behind with that first single crochet of this round. I previously put an additional stitch marker back here to make it easier for me to find. But as you can see, here I am, slip stitching into it. My yarn split there for a second, but I got it. Then I'm going to chain 1, and that finishes round 5. All of round 6 is worked in the back loops that we left behind in round 5. These back loops are actually from round 4. So first, let's remove that stitch marker we put on the back loop and single crochet into it. Now we can remove our beginning of round marker from the previous round and add it to this stitch. Then going all the way around in the back loop only, we're going to do 30 single crochet. I'm going to zoom ahead to the end to show you the next step. And here we are at the end of round 6. Once we finish our final single crochet into the back loop only, we move our end of round stitch marker. And then we slip stitch into the first single crochet of the round. After this, we do not chain. That is the end of round 6. Round 7 starts with a chain 2. This will count as our first double crochet. So first thing we're going to do is remove our stitch marker for the beginning of round, chain 2, and then replace our stitch marker into that second chain so that it is easy to find later. Then into the next stitch, a double crochet, then chain 1 and skip a stitch. For the rest of this round, you will repeat double crochet 2, chain 1, skip stitch 1 as a set 9 times till you reach the end of the round. I'm going to zip ahead to the end of the round. This repeat does end on a chain, which I make here, and then you can see the stitch that I would skip has my marker on it. I'm going to remove that marker and put it around the chain that I just made. Then I'm going to slip stitch into the second chain from the beginning of the round, which I put my beginning of round marker in. And that is the end of round 7. Round 8 technically starts with a chain 3, but I like to chain 2, add my beginning of round stitch marker to that second chain, like I'm doing here, and then I do my third chain. Then I'm going to skip a stitch. Then I'm going to start the repeating pattern of 1 double crochet into the chain 1 space, followed by 1 double crochet, followed by 1 chain and 1 skip stitch, repeated 9 times till you reach nearly the end of the round. I'm going to zip ahead to the end of the round so that I can show you what to do next. So I just finished my last repeat, and I'm actually going to do 1 double crochet into that remaining chain 1 space where my red end of round stitch marker is. Here I am going into the chain 1 space, creating my double crochet. Then I'm going to remove my red stitch marker and add it to my new end of round, which is the double crochet that I just completed. Then I'm going to slip stitch into the second chain at the beginning of the round, and that is the end of round 8. You should be able to see the staggered effect happening with the double crochets by this point. Round 9 starts with a chain 2. Let's remove our beginning of round stitch marker, chain 2, which counts as our first double crochet, replace our beginning of round stitch marker, then double crochet into that chain 1 space, chain 1 and skip a stitch, then repeat the sequence of double crochet 2, chain 1, skip stitch 1 9 times to the end of the round. I'm going to zip us to the end of the round so that I can help you with the next step. After our final repeat is completed, we're going to move our end of round stitch marker around the chain we just made. Then we're going to slip stitch into the second chain at the beginning of the round. I accidentally split my yarn here a little bit, but I'm able to fix it, and that becomes the end of round 9. Round 10 simply has you repeat round 8. To make it easier for you, I've added the instructions for round 8 at the bottom of this video so that you do not have to scroll back. I'll see you at the end of round 10. And that is the end of round 10. Round 11 is simply a repeat of round 9. To make it easier for you, I've included the instructions for round 9 at the bottom of this video so that you don't have to scroll back. I'll see you at the end of the round. And with that, we have completed round 11. For round 12, we're going to start with a chain 1, followed by 2 single crochets, starting in that same stitch that we just slip stitched into. First, let me remove my beginning of round marker. Here's 1 single crochet. I'm going to replace my beginning of round marker, followed by another single crochet. Then I'm going to single crochet into the chain 1 space. And I'm going to continue like this all the way around with an additional 27 single crochet, so that by the end of the round I will have made 30 single crochets. I'm going to zip ahead to the end of the round to show you the next step. And here we are at the end of the round, making our last stitches. Our final single crochet ends in that chain space at the very end. Let's move our end of round stitch marker to the stitch we just completed. And then we're going to slip stitch into that very first single crochet. And that is the end of round 12. Round 13 begins with 2 chain. First, let's remove our beginning of round stitch marker. And then into that second chain, let's replace the beginning of round stitch marker. Then we're going to skip a stitch, and for the rest of the round, we're going to repeat 1 double crochet, 1 skip stitch, 14 times till you reach the end of the round. I'll see you at the end so I can show you the next step. Here we are at the end, making our very last double crochet, and then our skip stitch is where our end of round stitch marker is. To finish this round, we are going to slip stitch into the very first double crochet. That is the end of round 13. You may notice that I forgot to move my end of round stitch marker. Don't be Alexis. Remember to move that stitch marker. And now we're ready for round 14, which starts with a chain 1. And then we're going to single crochet into the next stitch. And we're going to add our beginning of round stitch marker to this stitch. Now the next stitch is a single crochet 2 together. I'm going to enter the next stitch, pull a loop up, enter the stitch after, pull another loop up, and then pull 1 loop through all 3 of them. That is how you complete a single crochet 2 together. For the remainder of this round, you will be alternating single crochet and single crochet 2 together until you reach the end of the round. I'm going to zip ahead and see you there. Now we've reached the end on our last single crochet 2 together, and we have completed round 14. The next section of this pattern is actually worked in a row, not a round. First, we're going to take our piece and fold it flat. You can tell where the edges are based on the seam that you've created with the chain ups, and also where the loop is that you made at the beginning. You want the eyes to more or less line up. Once you've laid it flat, you're going to put your crochet hook back in your loop and chain 1. Then you're going to single crochet 5 across, going through both the front and back section. Here I've entered the front, and now I am entering the back. See how I have 5 loops on my hook? I'm going to pull a loop through and pull another loop through to complete my first single crochet. Then I'm going to move my beginning of row marker onto the stitch that I just created. I'm going to repeat that 4 more times, going through both the front and back section till I end up at the other end with 5 completed single crochets. I'm going to zip ahead and see you at the end of this row. And just like that, we have completed row 1. Make sure you do not cut your yarn at this point. Now we're going to make the beautiful tail of this Pisces soap sack. First, we're going to turn our work, and then we're going to chain 20. Now that we've reached the end of our chain 20, we're going to fold our chain back and slip stitch into the first chain at its base. Then we're going to slip stitch to the very next stitch as well. Then we're going to chain 15, and we're going to fold our chain back, slip stitch into the single crochet at its base, and slip stitch into the next stitch. Then we're going to chain 10, fold back our chain, slip stitch into the single crochet at its base, and slip stitch into the next stitch. Then we're going to chain 15, fold back our chain, slip stitch into the single crochet at its base, and slip stitch into the next stitch, which should be the last single crochet. Then we're going to chain 20, fold back our chain, and slip stitch into the single crochet at its base. Now you can cut your yarn, pull it through, and weave in your ends. Weaving in your ends is very simple. Just take a darning needle and the tail end of your yarn and weave through a few stitches. Then turn back and weave in the direction you came. Make sure you pick different stitches on the way back so you don't just end up undoing what you just did. And if you're nervous about it coming undone, feel free to weave it in going the other direction one more time. Once you've done that for both your ends, just trim off the excess and you're done. And just like that, your Pisces soap sack is completed and ready for the perfect bar of soap. If you end up donating your soap sack charity, let us know so we can add you to our grand total. Thank you so much for crocheting my Pisces soap sack pattern. I hope you have a bubbly day.